All right, we'll get started. Good morning, Stanford alumni and friends of Stanford. I'm Rodney Johnson, a member of the board of SPIRE, the Stanford Professionals in Real Estate. SPIRE is the official Stanford alumni organization, bringing together Stanford alumni, the Stanford community, and friends of Stanford from around the globe to connect, innovate, inspire, and challenge each other to move the real estate and built environment industry forward. If you're not a member and would like to join, we encourage you to visit our website at spirestanford.org. Welcome to our first webinar of 2024. Today's session, called Updates in Affordable Housing Finance, will be hosted by Hana Hardy Gunther, who will introduce our three panelists. But before we get started, an administrative note: we will be holding a Q&A session during the last 15 minutes of the hour. So please feel free to submit your questions by tapping your Q&A button. And we will attempt to respond to as many questions as we can get to. With that, I'd like to introduce Hana. Hana is an attorney for the city of San Jose, California. Her work focuses on affordable housing finance, and she also serves as a director and board secretary for SPIRE. Good morning, Hana.
Good morning, Rodney. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for that very kind introduction. We're excited to have this panel today on affordable housing finance and looking at what's working, what's not working, and kind of what the future of affordable housing finance is. I have the honor of introducing our three esteemed panelists: Regina Celestin Williams, who is the executive director of the nonprofit Silicon Valley at Home, whose mission is to design policies with the aim of boosting housing production in Santa Clara County, California. Regina has a background over 17 years in affordable housing development and community development. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in Urban Studies from Stanford University and a Master of City Planning at the University of Pennsylvania. And then our second panelist is Jair Lynch, who is the president and CEO of Jair Lynch Real Estate Partners, a fully integrated real estate investment development and asset management and development management firm based in Washington, D.C. Jair holds a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering and a Bachelor of Arts in Urban Design from Stanford. And our final panelist is Egbert Perry, who is chairman of Integral, which is a national urban development company headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. He served as chairman of Fannie Mae from 2013 to 2018, and Egbert received both a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science degree in Civil Engineering from the University of Pennsylvania's Town School, an MBA degree from Wharton. So with that, we're going to start with our first question for affordable housing finance. So Jair, when you think about the current market, where do you see the greatest challenges and opportunities for developers and investors in the affordable housing space?
Well, thank you, everyone. Pretty excited to be on this panel with Egbert. Great to see Rodney and Regina as well. When I look at the housing ecosystem in general, many of us are recognizing that we're woefully behind in terms of the amount of housing that's produced in this country. But when you look at the amount that actually is produced, about 90% of it is produced, especially new housing, is produced with institutional equity and debt. And that's mostly in the multifamily apartment space. And somewhere between 8 and 10% is produced in the affordable housing space, particularly the LIHTC space, utilizing government subsidies, a program that's been in place for since 1986. A new class has been identified and carved out, which has really been around impact and ESG, that is really opening up the opportunity for naturally occurring affordable housing and the preservation of that. And that has brought players from both kind of avenues of the housing production world into the same space. That has also been defined as workforce housing or attainable housing. And so usually you think of it as 3 lanes, with the bulk of it happening at the market rate level, a big established component happening through low-income tax credits, and now the more burgeoning and more institutionalized component, which is the naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAA.
Okay, great. So hearing kind of, one major theme, which is sort of what people call the missing middle, because usually there will be a lot of government subsidy for those folks who are at the, in the most need, have the most need, who are, facing homelessness or are unhoused presently. And then, of course, those who have no problems with affordability at the top end. And I know we're all seeing that in our markets. I'm certainly seeing that in San Jose, which is highly priced. Want to ask Egbert or Regina if you have any thoughts on the missing middle, also kind of with that, the supply issue, an increasing supply to meet that need.
I do have some, but Regina, you want to go first?
Sure. I think some of the greatest challenges is really access to the financing. Jair referenced that the deeply affordable housing typically relies on public subsidies. And what we're seeing here in California is a true bottleneck of being able to solve the housing crisis. We have regional housing needs assessments that our state government requires local jurisdictions to really put together housing element plans to provide the necessary housing units at every income level. And what we see typically is that the local jurisdictions meet those goals. And of course, the developers are the ones providing the housing. But in local jurisdictions, those goals are surpassed when it comes to market rate housing units that are needed, but woefully unmet when it comes to low income and very low income housing units. And a lot of that has to do with the subsidies that are required to meet that need. And even as we in the affordable housing industry try as we may to identify sites and entitle sites and create environments where we can produce more affordable housing, the funding's not there. And there's a tremendous amount of competition at the state level for those low-income tax credits that 95% of the affordable housing developments rely on. And so I'm really excited to be here today to talk about what we can do to release that pressure and build units outside of that low-income housing tax credit framework and outside of that heavily subsidized framework, because we have developers who are ready to move those projects forward if there's a alternative means of financing.
And I would add to that, I'm really just piling on something that both Jair and Regina said. This missing middle, one of the stats Jair put out there is a significant amount of housing production that we think of when we think of affordable housing is being done at the low end of the market in terms of deep affordability. And it's really being done by a lot of nonprofits, mission-based developers, and so on, and it's using low-income housing tax credits. But in the real world, that is the broader world, 90+% of all housing production is done by institutional players, the private marketplace using institutional capital and responding to the market. If you're trying to address housing affordability at scale, it therefore makes sense that you're not going to be able to get there by relying on the production that's done by the 8 to 10% that Jair mentioned. But the other 90 to 92% that is every day going about the task of building housing, and therefore having a way to have some percentage of workforce housing integrated into the efforts of a significant number of those private market players is how you get to scale, because you're dealing with 90%. So even if only a third of that 90% add 20% of their units as workforce housing inside of their housing production, you very quickly eliminate the shortage of workforce housing. And that's really more the missing middle piece of it. The teachers, the firefighters, the nurses, call it the essential workforce. Most of them live inside of that workforce housing bubble that goes from 60% of the area median to around 120%. In some high cost areas like New York or San Francisco or so, it may get up to 150 or 160% before you've gotten into the market rate category. So that's what I would say is you need to be able to engage that 90 to 92% in the problem solving, and the capital that goes into those projects cannot contaminate the capital stack. You can't introduce historic credits because they don't work. I'm sorry, low-income housing tax credits because they don't work well with conventional institutional capital.
Yeah.
Private.
There actually was a question from the audience about, what is low-income housing tax credits?
Yeah.
And so maybe.
So I'll try to address that question because I do think that it will be varying levels of understanding. So in every city, there are statisticians, especially at HUD, who will determine what an area median income is. And so in Washington, D.C., where I live, our MSA suggests that the area median income is about $150,000 for a family of four. That represents 100%. Low-income tax credits are a program that is set up to provide federal tax credits to financial institutions and others who will support projects that are at 60 plus or minus 60% AMI. And to make that plain and simple, that's about $65,000 to $70,000 for a single person. And as Egbert indicated, your starting teacher salary is just outside of that at $70,000 to $75,000. And so they've got their first job, but they can't get to housing that supports them. And they're stuck in the middle in that essential workforce chasm. And those tax credits that support that lower end of the market, let's say for working people making less than $65,000 for a single person, that is enabling what is a non-market transaction. So my dad is 91 years old, and he asks me, which side of your business can you double over the next 5 years? And we could double our institutional investing for market rate housing all day long, because there's a massive shortfall of that in the marketplace nationally. We cannot double our affordable housing or even LIHTC housing production because of what Regina said earlier, because there's the inability to make that a market transaction. So he's like, I don't understand that. And I said, well, Dad, what you do understand is that, before the pandemic, for instance, when you put $100 in the bank, your bank would only give you a 1 or 2% interest rate return. That was your return on cost. You put $100 in the stock market, and over a 20-year period, you usually get about an 8 to 10% return. Real estate, for opportunistic real estate, you're supposed to be right inside where the stock market is, 6 to 8%, let's say. Affordable housing is about 2%. And so what's the point of putting money into that if you could just put it in the bank and just have a savings account and get the same amount? So that's why the traditional investor base cannot support affordable housing at the lower end. And thus, the federal government has provided tax credits that takes care of a third of the capital stack, and local municipalities often have to provide another third of the capital stack in order to get it back to at least to be able to pay for debt. And so because of those two very, very limited sources, low-income tax credits and gap financing, there's no way to double or triple that in the marketplace and meet the need, as Regina indicated.
Well said.
Yes, thank you. Egbert, I wanted to turn to you about maybe some case studies on, you've been in the market as a developer the longest, you're most seasoned developer, and I'm just wondering if you can kind of point to sort of how the market has changed and, what kind of funding sources might have been available in the past and what you see working currently.
Well, thank you. And I should have said at the beginning, thank you all for having me here on this panel. So you notice Hannah said you're seasoned, you've been in it the longest. That's another way of saying I'm actually a fossil. I don't belong on this panel with these young, enterprising, and thriving young developers. I am integral is 31 years as of this past January. And then I was in another firm for 13 years before that. So I've been around for more than a minute. What I would say is, I want to change the context of the discussion, and I have my left hand, right hand little thing I do to explain what it is we do as a company. But let me say, first of all, if you think of affordable housing as not being exactly the crisis that we have in this country, but that what we have is a lack of housing affordability in communities where people with choice would choose to live, then it's no longer an affordable housing crisis. It's a community development crisis, because in order to make housing affordable in places where people will want to be, you have to be thinking about the schools and access to transit and other things that help to make a community. And the whole way the world's been constructed over the last 500 years, it's around creating heavens and hells. So some places have all the services and all the things necessary to sustain families and build community, and other places do not. So I'm calling that heaven and hell for a moment. And you cannot ensure sustainability in an economy that's built 73 to 74% around consumption. If you don't have disposable income in a neighborhood, you can't attract services. And so you need to be able not to concentrate poor people, but to create mixed income communities so that lower income households can have access to the services that are attracted by the presence of disposable income. So we don't call ourselves affordable housing developers. We've probably developed 10,000 units of housing over the life of the firm, but they're all, in our minds, market rate units with a seamless percentage of affordability integrated into those developments. And that's a very different construct. I would say I got there when I started the firm about 18 months in. We did a project that was, we responded to an RFP from the Atlanta Housing Authority to partner with the authority to redevelop the site of the country's very first public housing project. That project and an adjacent development made up 60 acres right in downtown Atlanta. What we basically did, there were 5 respondents. The other 4 suggested putting lipstick on the pig and renovating projects. And we suggested tearing the whole thing down, all 1,100 public housing units, in the most violent address in the most violent city in America in 1994, which was Techwood Homes was the project, and the average household income was $4,300 a year. And we basically created a 60-acre development that had a new school, an early childhood development center, YMCA, mixed income housing, using what Jair and Regina were talking about. We have some units that respond to the end of the spectrum, that is serving households earning 60% of the area median income and lower. We have the missing middle, and we have market rate, so in one development. And turns out that we ended up creating the legal, regulatory, and financial model that made mixed income housing like that possible. And today there are probably 300 such developments across the country. So we woke up the next day and we were national experts. And the whole idea is that you cannot create, you have to create communities that are sustainable over the long term. And if you're trying to uplift families and give them a shot at getting up the economic spectrum and have access to a decent quality of life, then you need disposable income as well as not to do Negro removal. I could use another word, which is what was done a generation ago, but try to find a way to integrate all income ranges within a community. So that's how I see the world, and that's how Integral has targeted its work over the last 3 decades. So that was one case study. And that kind of lives down towards the left. So the left hand, right hand this is community development, the left hand. It's about community, people, transformation, mission with a big M, profit with a small p, and Main Street. And this is commercial real estate on the other end, the right hand. And that's about making money. It's the deal, it's the transaction, it's Wall Street. It's just financial. And we try to live in the gray, in the middle, between black and white. So we're doing some amount of community development and affordability, but we're also leveraging the commercial real estate world. So we're creating this mix of incomes in our developments. One example in San Francisco that some people may know is a 360 Berry, I think it is. We did a 129 unit mixed income development. So 80% of the units are market, 20% serve households earning 90% of the area median or less. And that's a typical structure for what we try to do. And we call that 20% workforce housing. And that mix allows us to continue our philosophical bent. So I don't know if that resonates, but those are 2 case studies that I just wanted to mention.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Egbert. There was a question from Amy Ashton in the audience. Given the lack of funding, how can we all support more market rate homes? I know if you want to address that, and maybe in the context, especially of the second and the first project, and like what was the capital stack for those? What do you think is working now? What has worked in the past?
The 60 acres had multiple projects or components on them. So there were some developments that were done the way Jair described it. So you have significant tax credit equity. That was one, call it a third, but it's some percentage of the capital stack, meaningful percentage. Then there's another percentage that was additional public subsidy. And then the third percentage was just conventional debt. So that's the structure. And we have 738 of our units on that site were financed that way. On the housing, the for sale housing, we took the land cost, which was public land, created a second mortgage instrument, and put the land in with a forgivable tail on it so that it gets forgiven over time, but it's a second mortgage. And the first mortgage, plus some down payment assistance, allowed the home buyers to step in. So 20% of the units were structured like that, and the other 80%, in those days, prices were very different from what they were now, and the numbers were. And then we had a student housing development. We had a 330 unit pure market rate development. Actually, 5% of the units were affordable. So it's not a single capital stack. It's lined up with what you're trying to accomplish, but there are dollars you can target depending on the particular use or the particular goal that you have for that component of the project. I don't know if I really answered the question.
Right. I'll take a shot at maybe the broader question of how to produce more market rate housing.
Okay.
There is a significant amount of capital in any institutional portfolio that goes to alternatives. There's a specific amount that goes to real estate. Depends on the plan and the approach, but it's anywhere from 7 to 15%. That has provided a significant amount of capital liquidity in that market. Where there's often speed bumps is at the local level and is often zoning. And it can not only slow down market rate, but it could also be perverse enough to actually try to exclude deeper affordable housing and to do that, they just try to stop all multifamily housing from being built. And so there have been plenty of cases in California and Massachusetts in which there's a consistent bias against multifamily housing because of the fear of certain parts of the marketplace. And so the federal government has actually, and state governments have actually started to realize the disconnect. And there's starting to be more alignment between state and federal dollars that provides a carrot and stick approach to streamline zoning to incentivize more multifamily housing across the income spectrum, and tying transportation dollars or tying other dollars to that, so that we can get to a higher levels of production across the country, which would modulate pricing and allow for a broader, more consistent band of housing across the incomes.
So if Regina is not chiming in, let me just add one quick thing on that. And Zaire, I'm glad you said that. The other thing that's showing up is philanthropy is entering into the game as well. So philanthropic organizations are putting dollars on the table, lining up alongside public entities. Cities are saying, if I have extra land, if I'm a school system and I have land available, I can dedicate that to affordable housing. If I'm a transit agency, a hospital system, etc. And so you're able to take land cost out of your pro forma. Maybe you do a long-term ground lease, a nominal ground lease, any way to bring land in, not at the full fair value of the land. And then, so that lowers the land cost. And then to Zaire's point about zoning, a lot of cities recognizing this are allowing for people who have single family homes to also build ADUs, accessory dwelling units, on the site. So you can rent those units out, or you can have another party living there. So all of a sudden now that's another way to increase density without necessarily doing multifamily housing. And then the last thing is units are getting smaller to respond to the lower cost. Because with our immigration policy, the workforce that was south of the border that was here, supplying a lot of the construction labor and keeping labor costs down, they went back home and they're not here. So labor costs are high. Production of the materials have been low and never recovered after the Great Recession. So construction costs are high, and with the lower supply, costs are just being bid up more and more and more. So the problem is getting more extreme. So the need to implement these things I just mentioned is actually getting more urgent.
Question, is that philanthropy coming in at zero expected return or reduced return from market?
Both. They're doing, I'm seeing subordinated loans or just straight grants. But what they are saying is, if we do this idea of 15 years of affordability doesn't work for us. They want longer term, longer duration of affordability, and in some cases, deeper affordability. So not 80% or 100% of the area median. They want to be down at 30%. And they start losing me when they get way down, but I know that's Regina's territory.
Well, and I would even add to that point that we see tech companies getting involved as well, in addition to foundations. At least in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley, there is a deep recognition of the importance of everyone being housed and stably housed, and having housing affordability, housing access for people who live here and for the workforce that businesses want to attract to this area. And so we've seen large, mega tech companies like Google and Apple and Meta commit, hundreds of millions of dollars to investing in affordable housing because they recognize that it really affects the ability to build communities. Speaking to what Egbert was talking about, the need to have whole communities and neighborhoods that are stable, and recognizing that a key piece of that is that all of the population is housed and stably housed.
So many cities and regions have recognized that a part of their competitive advantage and or their competitive edge is having this connectivity between employers and the housing that surrounds them. And they have seen that cities that have the longest commutes have the lowest rents, produce the lowest GDP. And so many employers are coming to the table, sometimes through their philanthropic lens, but also from a competitive lens. We have discussed this with hospital executives, with school executives, that says that they make all kinds of decisions, whether it's in the Northeast around snow days or other things, 40, 50, 60 miles away, that they recognize that investments in that allows them to be competitive, to attract better talent. And hospitals have done this. Cleveland Clinic did this, and several others. So it's unfortunately it's still probably 1% to 2% of the total production, but people are starting to realize that they're going to have to get involved in order to create better places.
That's reminding me of the company town of the past, and I'm thinking, if I remember, Kaiser, the hospital company, and the founder there, I think in the Inland Empire in Los Angeles, I think began that way. They built their business, brought in housing, and then expanded, et cetera. But yeah, that's very important today.
Yes. So speaking of what's currently happening, we're going to discuss the future of affordable housing. This is aimed at Regina. Regina, as the executive director of SB at Home, you're looking closely at how private and public sector policy can boost housing production in Silicon Valley. What programs and policies do you think have been effective at boosting housing production, and what do you see on the horizon?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So this is my opportunity to acknowledge how grateful I am to be participating in this discussion. I just want to acknowledge, as someone who was a developer who's moved over to the policy side and is now a policy advocate, sort of the challenges of the market are that it's not really set up as is to perform and provide housing for everyone at every income. And so I want to acknowledge that both Jair and Egbert are innovators. They live in that space and work in that space that's kind of creating tension for the system as it exists, and challenging it to provide more housing than it's designed to provide, and operating in creativity that allows us to be able to serve folks who go unserved by the typical market forces and capital that exists. So again, I appreciate being in this conversation with both of them. What I wanted to share is that, in the policy space, there's a big push, especially where I work. I'm focused in Santa Clara County, to address the deep needs of folks who are living unhoused and getting pushed out of their housing every day. And so one example I want to give is the Santa Clara County Measure A bond that was passed in 2016. It was $950 million dedicated to addressing the homelessness that was growing in the county. Back in 2015, there was a recognition that 0 units were being built to house folks who were chronically homeless. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about permanent supportive housing, which is an evidence-based housing intervention that combines non-time limited affordable housing assistance with wraparound supportive services for people who are experiencing homelessness, as well as other people with disabilities. And so what we had in 2015 was about over 6,000 people who were living and housed in Santa Clara County, and no housing units being built to address housing those folks, 0. And so there was a community plan to end homelessness that was created shortly thereafter that put together strategies around coordination of county services, but most importantly, passing this nearly $1 billion bond to provide the funding to incentivize the affordable housing developers to start getting involved in building this sort of, again, housing intervention that really wasn't in existence in our county. Affordable housing developers were using low-income housing tax credits and other subsidies to build housing for folks who may make up to 60% of area median income, but they weren't providing that critical need that could help folks no longer have to live unhoused and unsheltered. And the challenge for our county is that while there may be, 5,000 to 10,000 folks living unhoused at any given moment, in the creeks, in their cars, on the streets, there's another 20,000 that are at high risk of being homeless at any given moment. And then there's another 65,000 households in Santa Clara County that are living over rent burden that also could be displaced. Maybe they don't become homeless, but they leave our region. They move, to another county, to another state, to another part of California because they can no longer afford to stay here. So there are tremendous pressures on our extremely low income individuals and households that the county realized it was missing the opportunity to really address those pressures. And so back in 2016, that bond measure was placed on the November ballot and it passed. And at the same time, I was involved as a developer in the building of Second Street Studios, which closed in December of 2016 as the first 100% permanent supportive housing development in the city of San Jose. So again, a community with a lot of folks living unhoused, and here we have the very first community that's dedicated to addressing the needs of folks who are living unhoused and are being most harmed by the existing housing market for the very first time in 2016. That development was 135 units. It was in San Jose, about a mile out of downtown, had a lot of services that were funded directly by the county of Santa Clara. And it really took a partnership between the city of San Jose providing funding subsidies, the state with the low-income housing tax credit allocation, and the county directly funding the service providers that would provide those wraparound services on site to move that project forward. And again, it just speaks to the importance of intentionality in disrupting the system that is harming so many families who feel the pressure of not being able to live here affordably and not be able to afford both housing and food and transportation, all the other things it takes to be able to have a thriving family. And so now we're at a moment again where we had a very successful bond measure. Now, again, it passed in 2016. Projects started becoming funded with these dollars. And now those funds have built over 5,000 units, nearly 6,000 housing units, and over 2,500 of those units are permanent supportive housing. So again, we went from zero to producing hundreds of units a year, and to the point where we have over 2,500 permanent supportive housing units in the county of Santa Clara. And those funds are mostly spent. So now we're at the point where developers have learned to lean in to serving folks with the deepest needs, to providing wraparound services, to designing buildings that serve folks coming in after years and even decades of being unhoused, and helping to stably house those folks. And the bond funds that passed in 2016 are starting to run out. And so now we're at a place where we're looking for the next innovation, the next funding innovation in our region. And so we're excited to look forward to the regional housing bond. There's an opportunity for our Metropolitan Transportation Commission, together with the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, to place a bond on the ballot for November 2014, this year, to raise $10 to $20 billion for the 9-county Bay Area for affordable housing. And a percentage of that would go to serving those with the deepest needs. And the affordability range is up to 100% of area median income. So there's an opportunity with $10 to $20 billion to provide resources to build housing at a variety of income levels, and really tackle both the communities that are prepared to continue to produce permanent supportive housing, all the way to those who are looking at innovations around missing middle and housing for those essential workers. And so we continue as policymakers to think about what is missing, what are the levers we can pull to incentivize more housing being built across income levels, because we understand that the need is so great, and that without any intervention, many families, many individuals continue to be displaced from this region.
Cool.
I give have just a minute. I don't know if Egbert or Jair want to comment on that.
Yeah,
Right.
Okay.
Oh, if you do, feel free.
No, I mean, it was well said, and some of the hardest work that's needed.
Yes.
So want to acknowledge that it's 4 times as hard to deliver a return on brain power for that is just tremendous to get to deliver those permanent supportive units.
We call it brain damage work at Integral. And to Jair's point, the further you go to the left, the heavier the lift. And when you're doing homeless housing, we priced a permanent supportive housing project on a site we have in San Francisco. It came in at $980,000 a unit. So you're going to spend almost $1 million to build 1 unit of permanent supportive housing, meaning housing that has no economic viability in the marketplace. That's a lot of subsidy. And so the brain cells that you use up trying to get that deal closed, you know, Regina still has her hair, but maybe that's a wig and all her hair is.
I think we can move into Q&A now. There's actually a question that goes with that. It's from Andrew McKay. He asks, how can we reduce the cost to build affordable or workforce housing? It costs almost $1 million a unit to build affordable projects in California. Would it be more efficient to convert existing units to affordable units?
Yeah, I'll jump.
Oh, yeah, you go first. You go first.
I was just going to say that at the moment, the costs are high, and we're looking to use every opportunity to reduce costs. And that includes conversion, that includes acquisition rehab, that includes preserving and making permanently affordable those naturally occurring affordable housing units. But really, there's certain things that we're trying to do in policy around streamlining, being able to make the process more efficient, to build housing, both streamlining the development process, the entitlement process and the development process, but also streamlining the funding process is something that we're looking into to try to shorten the timeline that it takes to build housing, especially affordable housing in California. And so we are looking at the various costs, but as Egbert referred to, construction costs continue to go up, especially in the Bay Area, and folks continue to need housing. And so there's a push to build that housing even while we're trying to shorten the timeline so that the cost can come down.
Just want to do a time check here. We are supposed to conclude at 9. I just want to see for the panelists, since we do have so many questions, if anyone's available to stay on an additional few minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. If not, it's fine. Okay, great. So we will try to get to all the questions. One question we have is, what should the investor community look for in investing in affordable housing development? For example, what is your checklist for greenlighting an investment or development of affordable housing?
Well, if you're a institutional investor, there is as I mentioned at the top of the hour, there is a new interest in impact investing that is typically happening in naturally occurring affordable housing. There's a couple things that help you define that. So it's usually older product, and as Regina indicated, thus the entry point is a lot lower. So if you have a high cost market and it takes you $500,000 to build, you probably could buy naturally occurring affordable housing at $200,000 or something like that. You're most likely in the suburbs, so you have to think about where are the job centers, and are you just buying it because it's there, or are you buying it because it's in the path of development and be part of the overall GDP? But a lot of people really have to get comfortable with older stock, and therefore your sponsor, your property manager, all your service providers have to be well-versed and subject matter experts in working in older stock, because there's just lots of different things. And many people are buying naturally occurring affordable housing with institutional capital. And one of the things that they're trying to do is green the buildings. And that's everything from low flow toilets to solar on the roof to more environmentally friendly finishes, whether it's paint or carpet or et cetera. All of those things become part of the investment criteria and checklist for naturally occurring affordable housing. If you're a tax credit investor, it's much more regulated. You're likely in a financial institution like a bank or something like that. Although there is some cry for some democratization of those tax credit investments, and some state tax credits are allowing individuals to get there. So there may be in the future an opportunity in which people would be able to lower their tax burden from their ordinary income with hopefully affordable housing investments, kind of at a micro level.
Very little to add to what Jair said. Certainly there's a return hurdle, and the more you go to an impact investor, the lower that return hurdle, so the lower the threshold you have to overcome on the economics, and therefore you're much more likely to meet the requirements of that type of institutional investor than if you're going to a straight real estate private equity shop that's looking for 18% return on investment. You can now talk about 7, 8, 10% return, and that takes a lot of challenge off the table. We tend to try to find something that is long-term, sustainable over the long term, that will maintain the value? Are you near transit? Are you near an employment center? Are you near something that's going to have value over time and will continue to keep the value of your real estate up? And that's important to us when we own the right, even though sometimes we're the ones creating that new neighborhood or environment or whatever. The other thing is you have to recognize that preservation versus new build, two completely different things. If you're buying existing stock, you're just preserving, you're not increasing supply. Now, if you buy a market rate product and then you make a percentage of them workforce or affordable, then you're increasing the amount of workforce housing. And so you're changing the distribution between market and workforce. New development is what increases the overall supply. So it really does depend on what that institutional investor is trying to do and what you're trying to do. If you're just trying to have a business that's successful making money, then, you know, just buying existing and doing some improvements and raising the rent, and that's a good thing because you're preserving. But if you're trying to solve the supply problem, then you need to be building new or buying existing market and converting some percentage to workforce.
And if you can get it cheap enough, and I don't know, Egbert, the conversion project in downtown Atlanta from office to residential, I don't know, the economics of that, but in terms of converting another use, active reuse, essentially.
Yeah, Rodney, that's a great point. That's an opportunity that's only recently shown up since COVID, but we're going to see a huge supply of office buildings desperately in need of something, and it's not going to be tenants because they're not showing up to large office buildings. And so converting office buildings to residential is an opportunity. It is extremely expensive, extremely complicated, because you can imagine you're now taking large square footages of open space or offices and trying to convert them into supply of plumbing and air conditioning and so on for individual residential units. And the geometry of the building is critical, right? If you have a big floor plate, you have to get light in on both sides. So a long, skinny office building is a better dynamic for conversion than if you have a big, more square type footprint, unless you're going to cut a hole right down the middle of the building to create a light well and admit light into those interior units. So we have a 41-story office building in downtown Atlanta that we're going to try and convert into 560 apartments from floors 9 through 41, and then retail and commercial and other uses on the first 8 floors. Pray for me. That is brain damage of a different kind.
Great. We have a question from Susan Murbach, and this kind of goes to basically real estate developers and investors entering into the affordable housing sector. Her question is, any vehicles for small investors to get involved, specifically thinking about limited partnerships that invest in affordable housing?
There are a few nonprofits that have capstone type of investment vehicles where you're getting below market returns, you're commingling with various investors. And these are kind of, let's call it sub $10 million, and the nonprofit or housing provider may use it as a revolver for acquiring projects that may end up being $50 million, and they use that to buy the land or pre-development or other things. There are very discrete places in which you can get involved. Some people get in, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people who are, let's call it either traditional or institutional investors, are more attracted towards the preservation and NOAA strategies. There's a little less risk. They can see and understand the durable income that's already there. And then I can imagine there may be some GP type of funds of which sponsors need dollars in order to get into projects that are smaller, and they're pooling, their 5 or 10% component. So there may be there may be a couple different places in which you can get involved as an individual investor.
Yeah, and, excuse me, I'll just add that there are what's called syndicators that are intermediaries in the low-income housing tax credit market that look to pool smaller investors into multi-investor funds. And so they're actually great ways to kind of get introduced to low-income housing tax credit investing because they're very experienced in identifying the projects and the communities that are being developed that need those sorts of resources. And some of those syndicators are also community development financial institutions. So if you're interested in some of the pre-development lending or shorter term investments, they also may have ways for you to enter into participating in that. I'm actually on the board of directors of a nonprofit syndicator. And so they are looking for innovative ways to introduce new investors into the space and to provide different products for affordable housing developers. So that's a great place to look into. And examples are the organization I'm on the board of is Merit Community Capital. There's the LISC, Low Income Support Corporation, I think, Enterprise Community Partners. Those are the nonprofit syndicators, but there are other for-profit ones that also do great work.
And you're going to see more crowdfunding opportunities, which is another way to have individuals and smaller checks show up to invest in real estate. There are some out there already, but I also know that there are others being created to more adequately democratize real estate investing, for a segment of the population that's been outside of the real estate investment world.
Great. We have a question from Chris Berg. He asks, can we talk about how land and lending is impacting the cost of housing? As banks loosen credit, it causes more speculation, thus raising prices. Plus, please speak to the cost of construction. With so much government money in the infrastructure bill, it raises the cost of construction, thus making housing less affordable.
Yeah, so I'll tell a funny story. I won't name names, but last fall we had a conversation with one of the largest construction companies in the country, and I'll be humble and say that there were a couple folks on my team who thought that they had read the economic tea leaves correctly. The leading indicators in terms of permits dropping and the like, especially for multifamily, and they thought that they were going to be able to open up the dialogue about where and when there'd be lower pricing. And I said, oh, I want to come to this meeting because this is going to be a dogfight. And so I show up, and this construction company brought in their lead economist, who quickly showed us that, as Egbert indicated, whether it's a lack of vocational training for the last generation and/or immigration and/or X and/or Y, there was still significant inflation as it related to construction job incomes. They were still floating at 6.5%, and we had seen that the number come way in from that in the national market across all different job categories. They also warned us that in a place like Washington, D.C. or the region, that many of the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing contractors were just fine not working on multifamily because they had all kinds of data center work to do. And therefore, you would see no reduction in pricing from those trades. There has been some modulation around a couple of trades, wood framing and the likes. But we are seeing very little. And when we say very little, everyone wants a 20-30% discount when they go shopping for clothes or cars or anything. You're talking 0 to 5% drop in construction costs, and that's going to end next year, and it's going to go right back up. And when construction costs are your biggest line item in new development, it is not creating any relief and or producing a lot more units. That's why Regina and other people were indicating you have to work on regulatory, you have to work on streamlining, you have to work on all these other things, because we're just not going to see massive discounts in construction pricing anytime soon.
And think about that in a world where rental rates are also moderating.
Yeah.
So you're seeing a flattening and maybe in some markets a little bit of a decline. So the costs are going up. But if you're a producer of housing, you can't get the rents to justify the cost. The things are going in a wrong direction. Unless there is a massive supply, an effective immigration policy could go a long way towards reducing the cost. Now, I happen to be, as was said, on the board of Fannie Mae for a number of years and was the chair of the board. And I can tell you that the housing production we're doing today is 70% approximately of what housing production was pre the Great Recession. We don't have the material production, I'm talking about the drywall plants and so on, to produce the materials for construction at anywhere the level that it was back in the day. So we had a permanent dislocation in supply, material supply, and we have, through our immigration policy, a huge reduction in labor force. You take those two things added together, and the fix is actually both regulatory and political. And until those happen, we're wasting time. We're all trying to see who has the best politics to get to a pot of money that can help make a project work, because the systemic fix has not been instituted. And you're right, all this money coming into the market just means that higher wages being paid on infrastructure projects. To Jair's point, why the hell am I going to waste time doing multifamily housing or housing production when I've got this nice gravy train of infrastructure work coming down the pipe? So the problem is going to get worse, not better.
Great. We do have a question from Morgan Balcather. Morgan asks, when leasing mixed income developments or buildings, have you experienced stigma from market rate tenants? If so, how have you addressed that?
Yes. We have a simple philosophy here. The person who doesn't like living next to poor people or next to Black people, I don't want them in the community anyway. So on the margin, first of all, so they don't have to ever rent, but you have to develop the property and manage it, if it's a mixed income community, to the highest common denominator. Because if you don't, you will not attract the market. At the same time, if you're committed to the opportunity that you're creating for lower income households to live in the community, then you have to also be respectful of and responsive to the needs of that population. And so it's art, it's not science, to figure out how you do the latter while sending a message to the former, the market rate households, that this is just a nice community. And so you better have some very high standards.
Yeah.
Be unapologetic about evicting people who are not prepared to try to be good neighbors, because you're managing the community for the 97%, not the 3%. And if you get too deeply involved in tolerating dysfunction, you destroy the community. So a mixed income community is a much harder thing to manage than a straight low-income housing tax credit community or straight market rate community, because you're trying to serve two masters. When we pro forma our deals, we take the market rate and we discount it by 15% and say that's the rent that we're going to get on those units. That's to allow for the fact that market rate units in a mixed income development actually command a lower rent than you can get in a pure market rate development. And so I didn't give you an easy answer. It's a lot of work and it's art, not science, but yes.
And I'll just add a story to that because that's exactly right. One example of the art that we saw was we had a mixed in community, and we're again in the DC metro, so lots of lawyers. And lawyers have been very good at giving back to community. They have it in their creed, they have their pro bono, et cetera. And we found out that in one community, we didn't get to an extreme situation where there was lots of problems, but we challenged some of the market rate residents that if you have internships, you know, your pro bono stuff, all that doesn't necessarily need to go to other parts of the city. It could start with your community, because you give one internship to the 16-year-old young man or woman in that community from the firm that you work in, you change the dynamic, because now you have an advocate inside that population that says, this is what's expected. This is how they act at work. This is how we're going to act here. This is what's going on. And creating those social bonds, even if it's at the anecdotal level, but creating social bonds inside a mixed-in community is really important, however it can happen.
And you should keep in mind that in order to remember, the whole idea of mixed income is you're trying to create something that is serving those two masters that I talked about. And if you think about what you have to do with a mixed income development, that's different from building housing for a lower income population. Here is what the decision process was years ago. When you're providing housing, affordable housing units, you said, okay, what's the first number the lowest amount I can spend and produce a unit that people will want to live in? Is it 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, whatever it is, and that's what you build. If you're doing a mixed income community, you start off with, what does a competitive market rate unit need to be, and how much does that cost? And that puts you up here. Now you have to use creative financing and subsidies and other things to help create affordability within that arrangement. Those are two completely different problem sets that you're trying to solve. And so you don't want tomorrow somebody builds next door to you and your project is obsolete. So you have to build to the market if you're doing mixed income or you want to track the market rate households.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. This is given that the State of the Union was last question from Nokoro, also Duru, also known as Duru, Ahantu. If possible, I'd love to hear opinions on Biden's State of the Union plans to extend housing opportunities through various policy proposals. I don't know if anyone had a chance to, hear about the current administration's policy proposals for affordable housing, but if you have, feel free to respond.
Well, I'll just add. Oh,
no, Regina, please.
I would just add that one of the biggest advocacy pushes over the last, I think, 4 or 5 years has been to relieve some of the bottleneck around affordable housing production by increasing the flow of tax credits to various states. And I don't want to get too technical, but there are some key sort of changes that can be made around tax-exempt bond financing to lower a threshold requirement that sort of allows tax credits to flow to projects. And we've been advocating for that nationally for several years, and that is very close to moving forward. It passed through those changes to the tax credit IRS code have passed through the House and are in front of the Senate. And so I'm sure that in his talking about moving housing policy forward, that's a big part of it. And it would, depending on what those changes are and how they're adopted, it could potentially double the amount of, we talked about earlier, can we double the amount of affordable housing being built? That could do it.
I was going to say those two things, because those are two of the big items, the increase in tax credits, or at least reinstituting something that's expired that keeps a higher supply of credits, and making it easier to use more bond financing. But I would add to that the president, it's a State of the Union address, it's like, let's throw everything on the wall and see what sticks. And last night didn't disappoint in that regard. But I will say the thing to take away is that there is a focus now on affordable housing as a fundamental part of infrastructure if you want a strong, healthy country. And that's a change, because affordable housing used to mean housing for low-income people. Now everybody's having affordable housing challenges somewhere in their family or somebody they know. And now we're now all invested in it. So that's the takeaway I get from that whole narrative last night.
And I agree with both points. I would add just a little color. What's sitting at the Senate today is actually a compromise between the Dems and the Republicans around an earned income tax credit and an R&D credit, and the housing became the nexus to be able to put this package forward. I think unfortunately we haven't gotten to a place where housing bills can stand on their own. We do not in this country have the political will, so they get embedded. And just a preview, there's all kinds of talk that next year there's about $4 to $6 trillion of tax provisions that are going to expire. And so we will see if housing gets placed inside the mix of all of that.
And Jair, I don't know how you feel, but I'm an advocate for, first of all, they should get rid of low-income housing tax credit and call it affordable workforce housing tax credit.
Yeah.
Because low income communicates something to some people.
That's right.
It's part of why there's a resistance to it. When the first project we did that had tax credits in it, first project we did while I was at Integral, because I did some in my previous life, it was so bad that the Housing Finance Agency in Georgia had a policy, if you're using tax credits, you could not do carpet and air conditioning because those were considered luxuries. Yeah. So poor people weren't supposed to be able to have carpet and air conditioning. This is in the hot South, right? And so we had to get that changed. And we used the fact that we were doing mixed income housing and said, 1 year, a market rate household may be in a unit. Next year, it's a public housing or tax credit household. But if it was reversed, if it was a tax credit unit and you dumbed it down, you would never be able to attract a market rate household in that unit. And they then removed the need for a waiver to put in carpeting and air conditioning. That's how the world has changed. That's why I'm a fossil. I'm done.
Thank you all for participating. We have just a few other questions I think we'll respond to offline. This has been a wonderful discussion. We hope to maybe continue with another series of affordable housing webinars in the next year. And Regina, Egbert, Jair, thank you so much, and Rodney as well for co-moderating with me. Hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.